Okay, so today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis again. Remember last class we talked about the first part of photosynthesis, so today we'll be talking about the second part of photosynthesis. Alright, just as a quick review, last class we talked about what is needed for photosynthesis and what is given off. So the requirements for photosynthesis, of course, are going to be the reactants in our equation, and then what is being given off, of course, is going to be the products. And photosynthesis is really important for life on Earth. Number one, because it produces oxygen gas, and I think I talked about it last class, but it really was the evolution of this process that put the amount of oxygen that we have in the atmosphere today in the atmosphere, so that we could have the evolution of aerobic organisms that did cellular respiration. Another important thing that photosynthesis does for us, and that it does for plants, is make food, and it makes food in the form of sugar or glucose. So last class, just as a quick refresher, remember that we talked about two different equations, or two different reactions taking place. The first reaction was the light-dependent reactions. The light-dependent reactions, of course, depend on light. So light was being used in the light-dependent reactions. Water was also being used in the light-dependent reactions. And then oxygen was being created in the light-dependent reactions. That oxygen was a waste product. Today we're going to talk about when the carbon dioxide gets used and when the glucose gets produced. Alright, so here we have our overall equation for photosynthesis, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to memorize this equation. And this equation is not that hard to memorize because you know the chemical formula for all of these molecules. You guys are smart and you've already demonstrated your knowledge to me. So just put it all together. Make sure that you know how to write it out as well. So we've got water and carbon dioxide in the presence of light. So here's our water. Our carbon dioxide in the presence of light is going to yield glucose, which is C6H12O6, and oxygen gas. The gaseous form of oxygen is always going to be two molecules of oxygen bonded together. Alright, so this is review. Why is the sun important in photosynthesis? The sun, of course, is important because it is driving the light-dependent reactions. This is how the water molecule is getting split, and we're able to use those hydrogen ions to make the energy carriers that we need. So those energy carriers, the ATP and the NADPH, are really necessary for the light-independent reactions. So we can take our overall equation and we can actually just take the parts that are being used for the light-dependent reactions and make an equation for the light-dependent reactions. So in the light-dependent reactions, of course, we're taking light and we're going to be splitting that water molecule, okay? The oxygen, right? This is our waste product, and it's just going to go up into the atmosphere. But those hydrogen atoms are going to be used to make the ATP and the NADPH. Alright, so this is the overall equation for the light-dependent reactions. And so these guys then, you would expect to find them in the equation for the light-independent reactions if they're needed for the light-independent reactions. Alright, so does photosynthesis occur in the dark? The answer to that question is simple. Yes, it can happen in the dark. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in the dark. But the part of photosynthesis that can take place in the dark or in the light is called the light-independent reactions. And this again means that light is not needed for these reactions. So we can do the same thing. We can take our overall equation, and we can make an equation that is just for the light-independent reactions. So in the light-independent reactions, we're going to take the ATP and the NADPH, the NADPH, which was created during the light-dependent reactions. We're going to use that along with CO2, which is going to come from the air. And all of that together is going to give us our glucose molecule. This glucose molecule is really important for plants and all living organisms, actually, because it's food. These light-independent reactions have another name, so they're not always called light-independent. Sometimes they're called the Calvin cycle. Okay, these names can be used interchangeably. And the reason it's called the Calvin cycle is because it was discovered by a scientist named Melvin Calvin. You see his picture on your paper. And then, of course, it's also a biological cycle. So we call it the Calvin cycle because he was the scientist that discovered it. All right, and this is what's happening in the light-independent reactions. The light-independent reactions, remember, are taking place in the chloroplast. So let's go ahead and draw a chloroplast. All right, this is our chloroplast. So inside the chloroplast, we have this fluid, and the fluid is called the stroma. Okay, so it's sort of like the cytoplasm inside of the chloroplast. And the stroma, this liquid, this is where the light-independent reactions or the Calvin cycle is going to be taking place. And then in the Calvin cycle, we have carbon dioxide coming in. And that carbon dioxide is going to come in from the air, and it's going to enter the leaf in through the stomata, and then it's going to diffuse into the chloroplast, into the stroma. Okay, so our CO2 is entering in. And then it's going to use the energy from the ATP and the NADPH to produce glucose. Okay, we can't produce the glucose without that energy from the ATP and the NADPH. Once the energy from the ATP and the NADPH gets used up, they become different molecules. So ATP of course becomes ADP, and NADPH becomes NADP plus because it's lost its hydrogen ion. All right, so some important parts of the Calvin cycle. Of course, the Calvin cycle does not depend on light, so it's called light independent. The Calvin cycle, remember, is taking place in the stroma of the chloroplast. The Calvin cycle is going to be using the ATP and the NADPH from the light-dependent reactions to produce high-energy sugars, glucose. And then the sugars are going to be formed from the CO2, from the carbon dioxide, in the Calvin cycle. Okay, so the CO2, of course, these atoms are going to be used to make the glucose molecule. All right, so why do you guys think the Calvin cycle has to turn 6 times? And it does. All right, hopefully you got the answer. The correct answer is that if we look at glucose, our organic molecule here, okay, glucose has 6 carbon atoms, and so the Calvin cycle has to turn 6 times so that we can make our glucose molecule. All right, so what do plants do with all of this glucose that they're producing during photosynthesis? Well, plants like us need ATP to survive, and they need a lot more than they're producing during photosynthesis. So plants are going to take that glucose and they're going to do the same process that we do. They're going to do cellular respiration and they're going to break that glucose down into ATP. Next class we'll be talking about this process of cellular respiration. Very important process as well, but cellular respiration, remember, is how we are making ATP, and we're going to be making it from glucose. Either plants are getting it from photosynthesis or we're getting it from the food that we're eating. Plants also, and we don't, but plants also use it as structure. And so an example of that structure might be cellulose. Hopefully you remember that cellulose is the component, it's the polysaccharide that makes up the cell wall. Okay, so plants need a lot of cellulose. Plants can also store that glucose for later use. How do plants store carbohydrates? All right, an extra credit point for the person who can answer this question. All right, hopefully you got it. It is starch. All right, so starch is how plants store glucose. And then they can make other sugars that they might need as well, like they can make fructose or maltose, depending on what they need to make. All right, so here we have our diagram of the chloroplast and the light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions that are taking place in the chloroplast. And I love this diagram because it really is a great overview of what is happening during photosynthesis. So let's take a look at this diagram. Over here we have the sun, right? And so the sun is going to shine down on our plant and it's going to shine down on our chloroplasts and strike these discs inside of the chloroplasts. These individual discs are called thylakoids, and these thylakoids are filled with pigments. The water is going to diffuse into the chloroplast, and remember that water is going to be coming from the veins, from the roots of the plant. And this is where photolysis is going to be taking place. So that water molecule is going to be split. We have oxygen, which is a waste product. The plant doesn't need it, so it's going to get rid of that oxygen really quickly. But remember, it's going to use those hydrogens. It does need those hydrogens to make our energy carriers. So it's going to make ATP and NADPH. The ATP and the NADPH, these guys are the energy that we need to make the Calvin cycle take place. And so remember that the Calvin cycle, of course, is taking place in the stroma, which is the fluid, and then the CO2 is coming in from the air, and then we're going to combine it with that ATP and the NADPH, remember, and it's going to turn 6 times, and we are going to make glucose, right, that the plant needs either for food or the plant needs for its structure. And then once that energy gets used up from the ATP and the NADPH, we end up with the uncharged versions, ADP, because we've lost that phosphate group, or NADP+. And these guys then are going to go back to the light-dependent reactions to get recharged. All right, so over here we have the light-dependent reactions. Okay, and the light-dependent reactions are using water and using sunlight and creating oxygen gas. And then over here we have the light-independent reactions, okay, which are going to be using this energy from the light-dependent reactions, CO2 from the atmosphere, to make glucose, which is the food. And then these guys, the ADP and then NADP+, are going to go back to the light-independent reactions and so on. So we have this nice cycle happening within the chloroplast, and every plant cell has many chloroplasts, so there's lots of photosynthesis happening in all of the plant cells. All right, so this final slide that you guys have, this is a diagram of a chloroplast, and you do need to know this diagram. So chloroplasts are complex organelles, right? More complex than, say, a vacuole, because they have a double membrane. They have an outer membrane, they have an inner membrane, okay? And then inside of them, they have these discs of membranes called thylakoids. So each one of these discs is called a thylakoid. Okay, and this is where the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis are taking place. It's literally on this membrane right here and this membrane right here that the sunlight is striking the pigments, and those electrons are getting excited and going through an electron transport chain and so on. But it's in the thylakoid membrane that the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis are taking place. So this is where the water is being split and the oxygen is being released. If we have a whole stack of thylakoids, right? So if we have like a stack here or a stack there, we call it a granum. Okay, a granum is a stack of thylakoids. It would be like having a stack of pennies or a stack of poker chips. Individually, you'd have the penny, and then if you had a stack of them, you'd have a stack of them. And then there's also a space inside the thylakoid. They're kind of like hollow, and that space is called the lumen. And the lumen is the place where we have all of these different pigments. Okay, so we've already talked about most of it. The last thing we need to talk about is the fluid. And so surrounding all of these thylakoids, we have this fluid called the stroma. And it's just like the cytoplasm. It's this fluid where these chemical reactions can take place. And so this is where the light independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle, is taking place. So this is where we're actually going to be making our glucose and using the CO2. Okay, so please make sure that you memorize this diagram. The big ones, of course, are going to be the stroma and the thylakoids. Make sure that you know where the light-dependent reactions are taking place and where the light-independent reactions are taking place. There is a test question that asks you where those two specific reactions are taking place inside the chloroplast. Okay, so hopefully this video was a good explanation for you guys. This video will be on Blackboard if you have any questions or need to review it. You can also come and see me during RAISE tomorrow if you need any additional help understanding what's going on. But hopefully I did a good explanation for you. Lab today. So you'll be getting on the computer, going to a website called explorelearning.com. You're going to type in this username and password. All of this information is at the top of your lab sheet. And then you're going to search for the photosynthesis lab, and when you get there, you need to make sure that you launch the gizmo. That's going to be one of your options. Also, please make sure that you actually log in and don't just log in the free trial, because you'll get kicked off of it after 5 minutes. This lab that you're going to be doing today, you're going to be looking at factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. So one way to think about the factors that might affect the rate of photosynthesis is to look at the overall equation. If you look at this overall equation, what are some things that you think could affect the rate of photosynthesis? All right, hopefully you notice that obviously we have light, and so if we didn't have light, we probably wouldn't have very much photosynthesis taking place. But also the light intensity, right? So light can be very bright or it can be very dim, and this happens in nature too. Where you've got plants that are exposed to a lot of light and then plants that aren't going to be exposed to as much light. And so a great example of this would be like in the rainforest, where we have trees that are up in the canopy, they're getting exposed to a lot of light, but then there's going to be trees that are lower on the forest floor, this understory layer, and a lot of that light is going to be blocked out, so they're not getting as much light. So the light intensity would be different. Another thing that could possibly affect the rate of photosynthesis, of course, would be water. Water is necessary for photosynthesis. And then also carbon dioxide. What happens when plants don't get enough carbon dioxide? What do you think happens if they get too much carbon dioxide? And then the other question is going to be, how do we measure photosynthesis? So if you wanted to do a lab, how could you measure photosynthesis? So if you look at your equation, you should probably be able to get some ideas of how you might measure photosynthesis. One way, of course, is oxygen production. If you could put a plant inside of an enclosed container, then you can measure the amount of oxygen it's producing. That would be one way. With aquatic plants, that might be a little bit easier because oxygen is a gas, and I believe that's what you're going to be doing in your lab today. But if we're looking at land plants, and this is not what you'll be talking about in your lab, but land plants, we can actually measure their growth, right? Because in order for a plant to grow, it has to do photosynthesis. It has to make these glucose molecules that are going to then make up its structure. So plant growth would be a way to measure photosynthesis. All right, guys, well, I hope that you have a good class today and that the lab goes well. Please make sure that you put the computers away when you're finished. All right, take care.